Why, you never volunteer in war. Although war in general isn't a pleasant place to be, there are some jobs that are just plain worse than others. Being the first up a ladder during a medieval siege, for instance, doesn't exactly give you great odds of survival. And absolutely no one really wants to be responsible for running messages along the trenches. You may find yourself in the unlucky position of doing some of these jobs regardless. But there are other jobs that some people have mistakenly volunteered for, and then discovered exactly why that was a terrible, terrible idea. Don't volunteer to test mustard gas chemical warfare using weapons like mustard gas. First appeared during World War I. A highly unpleasant substance, mustard gas was rarely lethal, but its victims suffered severe chemical burns and blisters, were often temporarily blinded, and experienced serious long-term health effects. Introduced by the Germans in 1917 at the Battle of Ypres, it soon earned the name King of the Battle Gases. Although it didn't cause the same volume of fatalities as other gases used, exposure to it required specialist medical care and caused severe damage to the respiratory system. Overall, the recovery time for its effects was much longer, and it lingered in the environment after being released, meaning large areas were contaminated. Something soldiers didn't always realize until their skin began to blister. By the end of World War I, just a year later, mustard gas was still fairly new, and its health impacts were not quite understood. It was only then that the long-term effects such as respiratory issues and eye lesions started to emerge. Quietly, each country began to examine the effects and impact of mustard gas. One way of doing this was by recruiting, quote-unquote, volunteer soldiers for experimentation and testing of mustard gas, as the Americans did in the 1940s. Despite this seeming like a test no one would willingly volunteer for, there were approximately 60,000 participants in the study. Many veterans have since spoken out about not being told what they were volunteering for or having been lied to. Conducted by the Chemical Warfare Service, they used a variety of different tests to measure the effects of mustard gas on the volunteers. As well as patch or drop tests, chamber tests, and field tests were used to examine the efficacy of newly developed protective clothing. These research projects predominantly focused on whether racial disparity had anything to do with the impact of mustard gas. As a result, these so-called volunteers were often minority soldiers, and as such they became the victims of these experiments, with many reporting effects such as cancer, eye injury, and PTSD in later life. One such veteran, Rollins Edwards, reported it felt like his skin was on fire. Men fainted around him and all were in bad shape. To make the matter even worse, and volunteering seem even more fruitless, there was a distinct lack of follow-up of these studies. No one properly measured the long-term effects and impact of being exposed to mustard gas during these trials, despite evidence mounting over the decades. In the 1990s, the VA began efforts to reach veterans and offer them long overdue benefits for volunteering and their subsequent lifelong sacrifices. Don't volunteer for latrine duty even in the comfort of your own home. No one particularly enjoys cleaning a toilet. In war, this is amplified tenfold as the task becomes an extremely unpleasant one. Anecdotes of soldiers unwittingly volunteering for latrine duty during boot camps circulate the internet, with many lamenting falling for the "any volunteers" cry they received from their drill sergeant. Latrines during the war, as one can imagine, were even worse. There were no modern plumbing facilities on the front lines of battle after all. Instead, if one was lucky, were long pits dug some way away from the trenches, where soldiers could relieve themselves. The less lucky, such as those at Passchendaele, merely had to use empty bully beef tins. throwing away their contents after use. Latrine trenches were looked after by personnel, who were expected to keep them in good condition, or as good condition as a hole in the ground could be kept in. Don't volunteer for night watch unless you're a night owl. Volunteering for night watch during war can be a dangerous business, as well as dealing with the potential attacks, and need to stay alert and survey the area. Tired soldiers also had to contend with one other big problem: falling asleep on the job. In some cases, the consequences of a soldier neglecting his duty like this could be disastrous. Someone could easily die. Positions could be exposed, and the enemy could sneak past defenses. That's why in 1806, the U.S. Congress made falling asleep on duty in wartime a capital offense, executing those who dozed at their posts. In 1861, one such near victim was a soldier who was on guard near Camp Lyon, Washington, D.C., the case of William Scott, now nicknamed the Sleeping Sentinel, caught the nation's attention and the president. Reportedly, Scott had volunteered for a second consecutive night of duty to relieve a fellow soldier who had fallen ill. After being found asleep at his post, he was immediately arrested and sentenced to death. Luckily, he received a pardon, going on to die some months later while saving fellow soldiers during the Battle of Lee's Mill in Virginia. Even today, falling asleep at your post remains an offense in many of the world's military. Don't volunteer to be a canary girl during the World Wars. The vast majority of the country's fit and able-bodied young men were quickly conscripted or volunteered to fight on the front lines. But they were not the only gender volunteering their lives to help the war effort. Despite not taking as large of an active part in the fighting, the women of countries like the UK still wanted to do their bit, and the men leaving for war had left the perfect opportunity open for those so. Naturally, with half the population off fighting, many workplaces suddenly found themselves with a distinct lack of employees, particularly as at that time the vast majority of their workforce was male. As munitions factories sprung up in abundance, it was women who stepped into the places left behind by the men. One such job women volunteered for was at the Royal Ordnance filling factories, where they worked packing shells with TNT, the result of which were some curious side effects, including causing the women's skin and hair to turn a bright yellow, earning them the nickname Canary Girls. This wasn't just a cosmetic effect either. Reportedly, babies born to canary girls during the war were also born yellow, although the color thankfully faded away. Turning bright yellow wasn't an ideal situation for anyone, but canary girls had other, more sinister health effects to worry about. Many suffered long-term, developing throat problems, bone issues, and in the worst cases, liver disease from the TNT chemical. Although they were given milk to drink to combat the chemicals, the women still suffered from anemia and immune system damage that led to over 400 women dying from TNT exposure during World War I. Don't volunteer as a medic at Passchendaele. Battle of Passchendaele was a particularly awful campaign that resulted in some of the heaviest casualties of World War I. Poor conditions and tactics resulted in a 5-mile advance at the cost of 250,000 soldiers' lives. And in the midst of it all were volunteer medics exposed to the harsh conditions of war. In the UK military, for example, Army nurses worked alongside VADs, voluntary aid detachment nurses, who worked at casualty clearing stations during the battle. These were only 6 to 8 miles from the front lines. And as a result, nurses faced the trauma of seeing the damage of war firsthand, suffered disease from infected wounds, and experienced the dangers of being so close to battle, with some dying. In blasts targeting these stations, the Red Cross estimated across World War I, 128 nursing members, 11 general service members, and 6 Joint War Committee members were killed in the war. with at least 100 other VADs also suffering the same fate. As a way to alleviate some of the horrors of combat, social convention and international law make some individuals on the battlefield off-limits to deliberate targeting. Very often, however, in the heat of battle, these conventions are ignored, and those who should be off-limits are intentionally targeted. Rules and customs of war date back centuries. By the 18th century, the majority of the officer class in an army would be made up of the aristocracy, men of wealth and privilege. These individuals would often attempt to conduct war in a gentlemanly fashion. One of these involved the treatment of enemy officers in battle. The deliberate shooting of officers was considered barbaric and to be avoided. During the American Revolution, while it was never official policy to target officers, the Continental Army did create a unit of sharpshooters who made use of highly accurate long-range rifles, giving them the ability to pick specific targets, as opposed to their regular army counterparts, who were armed with much less accurate smoothbore muskets. Under the command of frontiersman Daniel Morgan, these rifles played a decisive role at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. According to legend, one of his men, Timothy Murphy, under Morgan's orders, deliberately shot and killed British General Simon Fraser. Morgan's other men also targeted other officers and artillerymen, throwing the British advance into confusion, allowing the Continental Army to win the battle. Exactly what did happen is a bit vague, but Fraser and the other officers were definitely targeted by American sharpshooters, giving the Continental Army a decisive advantage. While there was never an official policy to target such individuals, those with the means to do so were more than willing to seek out officers for special attention, no matter how barbaric it may seem. Over the years, restrictions on targets were formalized into official treaties. One of the most prominent of these restrictions is the prohibition of medics and medical personnel as legitimate targets. Some nations, however, not only refused to acknowledge these international guidelines, but also made the deliberate targeting of medics a standard tactic to be used by their armed forces. Two treaties that govern the conduct of soldiers on the battlefield are the Hague Convention and the Geneva Convention. The latter is a series of agreements dating back to 1864, which govern the conduct of 1864, which govern the conduct of soldiers on the battlefield. It was updated in 1906, 1929, and most recently in 1947. Though additions have been made and the exact wording of the treaty has changed over the years, any deliberate attack on a medic or medical personnel, or any unnecessary hindrance in the performance of their duties, is considered a war crime and can be prosecuted accordingly. Furthermore, medics are not to be taken as prisoners of war. Should one be captured, he should be returned to friendly lines as soon as practical, and no distinction is to be made between military medical staff and civilians. Temporary auxiliary medical personnel, such as stretcher bearers and those who transported wounded or sick soldiers, are also considered non-combatants, while performing their duties and given the same consideration as designated medics. Medics are allowed to carry weapons for personal protection or to defend the wounded under their care without forfeiting their status as a non-combatant. However, should the medic engage in offensive combat alongside other soldiers, he would forfeit his immunity and be treated like any other soldier. For the most part, during World War II, medics did not carry weapons, though there were some exceptions. To ensure these personnel are easily identified, to ensure their protected status, many nations would mark them with special symbols, most often a red cross on a white background. This symbol would be displayed on tents, vehicles, as well as helmets and armbands, as a quick visual reminder of the special status of the bearer. During World War II, most major powers were signatories of the conventions, including the United States, Great Britain, and Germany. By and large, These nations respected medics and avoided deliberately shooting them while they tended to the wounded. There were some exceptions to this. For example, some SS units would intentionally wound enemy soldiers. When medical aid arrived on the scene to treat the casualty, the SS soldier would fire on the medic, hopefully killing. There are also incidents of Allied soldiers firing on German medical personnel in clear and deliberate violations of the Hague and Geneva Convention. While there are many examples of this happening on both sides, for the most part, the non-combatant status of the medics was respected on the Western Front. Medics would often tend to soldiers of either side. In one example, a pair of American medics used a French church as an aid station on D-Day 1944. Wounded soldiers from both sides were given the same treatment. The only restriction was that all patients had to leave their weapons outside. Both American and German soldiers' lives were saved due to their intervention. On the Eastern Front, the situation was entirely different. The Soviet Union did not sign the Geneva Convention, and the Hague Conventions were signed by Russia in 1899 and 1907, with the Soviet Union never confirming its status as signatory, which provided the justification for Nazi mistreatment of both prisoners and medical staff. When in combat, medics would be treated like any other soldier and would be eliminated without hesitation. Should a Soviet medic be captured, he would be sent to a paramount camp as any other soldier. Conditions in these camps were horrendous, with the Nazi regime deliberately underfeeding Soviet POWs. The main aims of the German war effort in the Eastern theater of the war was Lebensraum, or living space, for ethnic Germans. As a result, treating the Soviets, be they medic, prisoner, or any other protected class, with utter contempt, flew in the face of the Nazi ideology. In response, Soviet soldiers also didn't respect German medics or medical personnel. The war on the Eastern Front was one of untold brutality, with both sides committing atrocities against the other with no regard for international law. Across the globe in the Pacific theater of the war, another military would make the killing of medics a priority. As the United States and other Allied powers conducted their island-hopping campaign, it was soon apparent that the non-combatant status afforded to those in medical fields was not applicable. Although the Empire of Japan did sign the Hague Convention in 1907, and it also signed the Geneva Convention of 1929, but it didn't ratify it. Japanese leadership believed that upholding the treaty would encourage the Americans to bomb Japanese cities, as any captured airmen would be treated as legitimate POWs rather than war criminals, which was what the Japanese considered them to be. As a result, the provisions of the conventions were ignored. While on campaign, many medics found themselves the subject of special attention from their Japanese foes. The red cross on a white background that was worn on both helmets and armbands, symbols that in other theaters provided a degree of protection, did little more than single out the wearer as the subject of special attention. Medics and corpsmen would remove these insignia and wear the same uniforms as their comrades, as any feature that distinguished them as medical personnel would only put their lives in unnecessary risk. Additionally, medics and corpsmen in the Pacific theater would routinely carry weapons and fight alongside their comrades, though it was a direct violation of the Geneva Convention. There was little point in following its rules, as the enemy didn't respect the convention anyway. Army Medic and Medal of Honor recipient Desmond Doss noted the Japanese obsession for attacking medical personnel. In one interview after the war, he stated, quote, "To them, the most hated men in our army were the medics. They would let anybody get by just to pick us off. They were taught to kill the medics for the reason that it broke down the morale of the men, because if the medic was gone, they had no one to take care of them. All the medics were armed except me." End quote. As Doss states, the main reason for targeting medics was to harm American morale. Should a soldier be wounded, It should be the actions of a medic that would be the difference between life and death. Should the medic be killed or otherwise incapacitated, there would be no immediate aid for any other wounded soldier. For centuries, the designation of legitimate and illegitimate targets has been enforced, both as a social convention and in formal treaties. In spite of this, many have simply ignored these restrictions in order to gain an advantage on the battlefield. Why you must not fall asleep in war. Nothing is more closely intertwined with war than extreme sleep deprivation, which can have major performance and morale-sapping effects on the rank and file. It's pretty hard to remain enthusiastic on a campaign when your eyelids feel like lead blocks. You can get yourself and your buddies killed. It's a truth about as old as war itself. The slumberous sentry, caught unawares, not only gravely endangers himself, but everyone around him. In the First World War, lethargic Germans on the front line often learnt this the hard way when their beauty sleep was abruptly disrupted by either a thwack to the head, a stab to the chest, or a grenade to the face. In the dead of night, the British regularly carried out trench raids on their opposing number. This involved crawling under German wire in the pitch black and noiselessly dispatching any heavy-lidded watchman with a rifle butt or a club. Once disabled, the raiders made their way around, announcing themselves by tossing grenades and finishing off any survivors with rifle charges. Hitting the sack in World War II was fraught with the same danger. Oegina Sledge of the Pacific fame relates how one night Japanese ambushers rushed toward their camp out of nowhere. In the ensuing chaos, the intruders were slain. In the darkness, a lone groan sounded, and someone was sent to end it with a pistol shot to the temple. However, to his horror, when morning came, Sledge realized the moaning man had been one of his own comrades. Bill had been accidentally executed by one of his own because his foxhole buddy Sam, who was meant to be on watch, had hit the hay and was unaware that his partner was out of the hole and gravely injured. It was the ultimate betrayal. You can get executed. For millennia, drowsy delinquents have been handed severe punishments designed to dissuade others to think twice about nodding off. As such, these reprimands aren't usually meant to teach the offender a lesson. Why? Because they're usually not alive by the end. One of the first to mete out this sort of justice was the ancient Greek general Iphicrates, who famously stabbed to death a sleeping sentinel on the spot with a spear. "I left him as I found him," he cruelly proclaimed afterwards to his horrified men. The Romans were equally brutal, preferring blunt force to the clean, sharp jabs of the spear. According to Polybius, if a soldier was discovered napping on post, he was beaten to a pulp with cudgels and stones by his colleagues in arms. There was nothing like the sight of your comrades' flying brains to persuade you to stay wide awake. During World War I, snoozing at the wrong time could also spell your doom. At the Battle of Gallipoli in 1915, 3 soldiers from Australia were court-martialed and condemned to death for the crime. Luckily for them, this was later reduced to the more attractive prospect of 5 years in jail. In fact, it was common practice during the Great War to commute death penalties in favor of softer punishment. One of the most popular of these, known as field punishment number 1, involved the strapping of the weary wrongdoer to a fixed object, like a wagon, for up to 2 hours a day over a period as long as 3 months. These mortified miscreants were often left to contemplate their own mortality, because they were sometimes placed within range of enemy shellfire. Others were spread-eagled and tied to wheels in public and forced to endure the jeers of the local people. In the modern U.S. military, the maximum possible punishment for dozing off is a lot less humiliating but still ruinous, with regular personnel given a dishonorable discharge, forced to forfeit their pay, and imprisoned for up to a year. However, according to article, 95 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. In times of war, those caught catnapping on the job can still be executed even today. You can get captured during times of conflict. One of the most effective ways to capture an enemy combatant is not by forcing their surrender, but by taking them when they're at their most defenseless. This is exactly what happened during the capture of Fort Ticonderoga, the first American offensive in the Revolutionary War of Independence against the British. Located in the state of New York in 1775, the American forces planned to take the British fort to control the ships coming down from the nearby river. Under the command of Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold, and the cover of night, the American renegades walked through the open gate, where they stumbled upon a snoring British lookout. Switching from one sort of unconsciousness to another, he was rudely awoken with a bash to the head. The men then climbed the stairs, where they found all 83 British troops tucked up and fast asleep. A splinter group went to capture the British leader, Captain Delaplace, who, roused from his bed, awoke to find himself in an actual nightmare. You can get killed by your own men out of harm's way and surrounded by resting buddies. You'd think one of the safest places to nod off was in a military base. However, for many senior officers serving in Vietnam, this seemingly secure bastion had enemies around every bunk. Towards the end of the U.S.-Vietnam War, morale among free world forces was at an all-time low, due to the prevailing belief that the conflict was not only unjust, but impossible to win. Terrified and angry that a bad commander might send them to their deaths with a boneheaded tactical gambit, servicemen began taking their fate into their own hands. Fragging during the U.S.-Vietnam War was the act of tossing a live fragmentation grenade into the tents or quarters of a despised senior officer. It was the perfect crime because the destruction of the grenade shell would ensure that any fingerprints were also eviscerated alongside the victim. This murderous phenomenon was exacerbated by the drug-addled minds of some of the perpetrators, who fried their brains with a cornucopia of illicit drugs to get them through their deployment. Handing out disciplinary charges could be viewed as justifiable reason to reduce a senior officer to fundamental units of matter. Overall, a total of over 800 fragging incidents were reported in the U.S. Army and Marines alone, making the U.S.-Vietnam War one of the major campaigns in which the old proverb, "Keep your friends close and your enemies closer," should be taken literally. You can lose an entire war. Every blunder mentioned here pales in comparison to the one committed by Adolf Hitler himself, who had slept at one of the most critical junctures of World War II, scuppering the Aryan dream with his own dreams. On June 6, 1944, the Allies crossed the English Channel by boat and plane, the final destination being Berlin. In the early stages, the assaulters feigned to gain a solid foothold in the Cherbourg-Havel area. With the Allies temporarily set back, this was the perfect time for the Germans to press home their advantage. A formidable brigade of reinforcements were waiting on the sidelines, and there was now a real opportunity to crush the invasion before it really got going. Far away from the front lines in Berchtesgaden, Germany, a phone began ringing in the low rooms of Berghof, Hitler's headquarters at the time. The caller was Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who was worried that, unless something was done, that enemy forces would turn from a trickle into a flood. What the Germans needed now was the permission of the ultimate authority to change tactics. But when Hitler's attendants went to find him, they discovered the Führer was out like a light. Terrified at the consequences of suddenly waking him up and giving him false intelligence, the assistants rather left him be. When he was stirred from his bed, Hitler approved a transfer of tank divisions to Caen that had been requested 12 hours earlier. But by then, it was too late. The Allies had recovered too strongly, and D-Day, a significant turning point in World War II, was now theirs. So, whether you're a lowly private or the commander-in-chief, don't you dare fall asleep, because you'll either wish you were dead or you'll actually be dead. Don't make the medic's life more difficult. By its very nature, warfare is dangerous. In order to mitigate the suffering it inevitably causes, combat medics, surgeons, and other medical personnel will go above and beyond to ensure that even the most grievously injured soldier has a chance of survival. In spite of this, there are some things that soldiers have done that serve no purpose other than to make the already overworked medical staff's life that much more difficult. These are some of the actions that cause the medic to wince in frustration. Don't light a cigarette with a flamethrower. For over a century, soldiers and tobacco have been inextricably linked, whether due to the stressful nature of their profession, the boredom that inevitably comes with military life, or any other fact. Tobacco use was common, and cigarettes were often given to soldiers as part of their ration. Of course, in recent decades, the health risks of tobacco usage are well known, though they are usually cumulative, only occurring after many years of continuous usage. Sometimes the risks can be more immediate. Since the First World War, flamethrowers were part of the arsenals of many nations, playing an important role in the trenches of the Western Front, the jungles of the Pacific Theater, and many other places across the world. There are many variants, but all share the same basic operating principle. A flammable liquid is pumped from a fuel tank through a hose and sprayed out of a nozzle. The liquid is ignited from an open pilot light at the end of the spout. There is no documented case of someone lighting their cigarette from the burning stream, something even the most daredevil soldier wouldn't seriously consider. Though there are numerous examples of soldiers lighting their cigarettes with the pilot light at the end of the nozzle. While this may look cool, this practice is extremely dangerous. Putting one's face close to an open flame can lead to severe injury. Something as simple as an unexpected gust of wind could blow the flame into exposed skin. Something similar happened in 1916, when a French flamethrower regiment was conducting an assault on German positions, when a gust of wind blew the burning fuel back on the operators, killing 25 of them. The effects of a pilot light won't be so dramatic, but the risk is still the same. Even briefly touching exposed skin to hot metal can lead to burns. These include second-degree burns, which can involve blisters and discoloration, and is extremely painful, and possibly third-degree burns, which destroys all layers of skin and sears away nerve endings. Both include a risk of infection and further long-term complications. If there is a desire to smoke, it's advised to light up with a match or a Zippo to avoid these hazards. Don't cook with C4 plastic explosive. There's no doubt about the morale boost of a warm meal, especially in a combat zone. To this end, soldiers have resorted to less than conventional methods to heat their food up. During the Vietnam War, American soldiers in the field would subsist primarily on C rations, prepackaged meals that provide all the nutrients and calories needed. Soldiers would also be issued heating tabs designed to heat the C rations to make them more palatable. Sometimes, however, these heating tabs were unavailable, forcing troops to improvise. Along with their other equipment, American soldiers would be given a Claymore anti-personnel mine. The main explosive that activated the mine was a block of C4. When they had downtime, soldiers would disassemble the Claymore, breaking off a piece of the putty-like substance and using it as fuel for heating their rations. This action was and still is frowned upon by the military. Contrary to popular belief, C4 is remarkably stable and will not explode unless a detonator is used. It will burn, however, and produce a highly toxic smoke. In addition, the fumes smell really bad, with one veteran saying that a sniff of smoke will cause you to the chemicals in the explosive particularly RDX, also known as cyclonite, have been known to cause seizures, nausea, dizziness, and if or ingested in large enough doses, kidney failure, permanent neurological damage, and gastrointestinal issues. A medic in the field would not have the ability or proper equipment to deal with these problems. Furthermore, by removing some of the explosive from the claymore, it becomes less effective, meaning its function is significantly diminished. It's recommended that a soldier use a provided heating tab, or just endure a cold meal, rather than take the health risk or interfere with the effectiveness of the claymore. Don't drink from a gun barrel. In 1994, a 19-year-old French soldier was initiated into his artillery regiment. After several rounds were fired from a 155 mm howitzer, he drank 250 of wine that were poured down the barrel, a unit tradition. About 15 minutes later, he began convulsing, with seizures lasting for almost half an hour. After being rushed to the hospital, he was subjected to a battery of tests, all of which came back normal. After more testing, it was concluded that he had suffered from acute tungsten poisoning, the first recorded case of such a condition. Further analysis suggested that tungsten was not to blame, but rather RDX, or cyclonite, the main ingredient in C4 as well as other explosives, here being used as a propellant charge. In a similar fashion, soldiers stationed in Vietnam have been documented shotgunning marijuana, where one soldier inhales from a joint, then exhales the smoke into the receiver of a shotgun, propelling it down the barrel. Another soldier inhales the smoke as it escapes from the muzzle of the weapon. Either way, drinking wine or any other substance from the barrel of a gun is highly dangerous, whether it be an artillery piece or a rifle. The barrel, as well as other internal workings, can be coated with any number of harmful chemicals. These include residue from gunpowder and other explosive propellants, toxic metals such as lead, as well as lubricants, solvents, and other noxious chemicals that can have a negative impact on health. Dirt, grime, bacterium, and other contaminants can also be found in the workings of any firearm, which are best kept away from the mouth. This practice is also a violation of the second rule of universal firearm safety, that also includes artillery pieces, which states that the user of a firearm should never point the muzzle of the weapon at anything or anybody unless you fully intend to harm them. Voluntarily placing one's head directly at the business end of a shotgun or any other weapon can be charitably described as reckless, if not outright insane. Needless to say, the medic as well as the rest of the medical personnel highly discourage this practice. Avoid violations of the universal rules of firearm safety. In order to avoid serious injury or death when operating firearms, as well as other similar weapons such as artillery pieces and flamethrowers, the universal rules of firearm safety was developed. 1. Treat every weapon as if it was loaded. 2. Keep your finger off the trigger until you're ready to fire. 3. Do not point the firearm at anything you are unwilling to shoot. 4. Be sure of your target and what's around it and behind it. For example, don't look down the barrel of a gun when cleaning it. Disassemble the piece before doing so. Only when the barrel is detached from the rest of the weapon is it safe to look down. If the firearm jams or has any other malfunction, do not, under any circumstance, look down the barrel to check for an obstruction or any other reason. Keep it pointed in a safe direction until the issue is resolved. For soldiers fighting in ranks, as was done in the era of black powder weapons, it's imperative that close order be maintained. Should fire by rank be required, those in the rear ranks must be able to fire over the heads or shoulders of those in front. If there's too much distance between these ranks, unfortunate accidents can occur. Likewise, those who kneel when conducting volley fire must stay in a kneeling position until ordered to do otherwise. Do not carelessly place yourself in a position where you are in line with the muzzle of your comrade's weapon. Lastly, be certain of what you're shooting at before pulling the trigger. Blue-on-blue incidents are tragic and can often be avoided with the proper target identification. Warfare is dangerous enough. By following these rules, as well as using common sense, unnecessary casualties and incidents can be avoided, and the medic's life can be made just a bit easier.